Before rooftops, before bricks and cement, even before words were carved into stone. There was a time when the only shelter humans had were huts made of straw, leaves, and fear. In that time, a storm could erase a village. One gust of wind could leave a family homeless. But then, one man stood up and asked, "Why must we live like our ancestors? Why can't we change?" His name was Karuk, not a leader, not a priest, just a man with a strange question. If I can chop down a tree, can I build a house from it? No one believed in him. No one helped him. As others mocked, he began, alone, with bare hands, a stone axe, and a will sharper than any blade. This isn't a story about brute strength. It's about solitude, about pain, about determination carved into wood and bone. And if you think only modern people know how to challenge the world, you need to hear what Karuk did. Where are you? Watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more powerful, inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The storm came like a beast with no eyes, no mercy, and no name. It tore through our land as if the sky itself wanted to erase us. The wind screamed louder than any hunter. Rain poured like the tears of angry gods. Thunder cracked open the night, and trees snapped like dry bones. When the sun finally rose, it found us not standing, but scattered. I stepped outside what used to be my shelter. There was nothing left but mud and silence. Our straw huts, once clustered like a small tribe of turtles, had been ripped apart. Pieces of leaf, bark, rope, and bone were tangled in pools of rainwater, and the people, they sat like stones, hollow eyes, shaking hands, children clutching mothers, mothers clutching nothing but wet cloth. No one spoke. Even the fire was dead. I am Karuk. I was not the strongest of my people. I did not lead hunts or chants, but I have always been the one who watches, who learns. From the wind, the earth, the pain. That morning, I watched again. I watched how our way of living had failed us, again and again. We called ourselves survivors. But what good is survival if every storm knocks you to your knees? That day, something snapped, not in the trees, not in the huts, but inside me. I looked around. Our ancestors had taught us to live light, to rebuild with straw, to hide under leaves. They believed we were too small to fight the sky, so we bent. We ducked. We waited for calm. But calm never stayed long. A large tree had fallen near the center of the camp. Its trunk was split but still rooted. It had fought the storm and lost, but it was still there, not blown away like grass, not washed out like mud. It remained. I knelt beside it, ran my hand across its bark. It was solid, scarred, heavy, and stubborn. It was everything I wanted to be. That's when the thought came. Not as a voice, not as a vision, just a simple, aching question inside my chest. What if we stop hiding beneath the storm and start standing against it? I had once made the first stone axe. Not for glory, not for power. I made it because I was tired of breaking sticks with my bare hands, tired of scraping firewood like a child. That axe became my tool, my weapon, my name. If that axe could take down a tree, could it also raise a home? Not a nest of straw, not a bundle of leaves, but a real shelter, one that stays, one that dares the wind to try again. I stood up, soaked to the bone, and shouted inside my mind, I will build something that survives. I will build something no storm can swallow. No one heard me. No one needed to. This was between me and the sky. I began alone. No one asked where I went. No one offered help. Maybe they thought I was grieving in my own way. Maybe they thought I had finally broken. It didn't matter. I was done asking. That night, I slept beside the fallen tree. Rain still dripped from the leaves. The fire hadn't come back yet. But inside me, something else burned. People say the fire died that day. They're wrong. The fire just moved. It climbed into my hands, into my eyes. It whispered in the swing of my axe, in the tension of my muscles, in the silence between each breath. Build, or be blown away. That night beside the fallen tree, I didn't sleep much. The ground was cold, and the wind still whispered through the branches above. But I stayed. I placed my back against its bark and let my mind drift, not into dreams, but into memory. I remembered how it began. Not the storm, not the house, the axe. I was younger then, foolish maybe, but stubborn in the way only hunger can make you. Back in those days, we tore wood with our hands, snapped small branches, dug with sticks, burned whatever the forest gave us. But one winter, the wood ran out. The small trees near the camp were gone. What remained were thick trunks that laughed at our bare fists. And so, one night, I watched a wolf tear meat from bone with its teeth, and I thought, what if I could make a tooth that doesn't rot? One that fits in my hand? That's when the axe began. It wasn't easy. The first stone shattered. So did the second. My palms bled. My fingers split. The others said I was wasting time. Better to dig for roots, they said. Better to sit by fire and wait for luck. But luck doesn't split logs. Pain does. Repetition does. Fire in the chest does. Eventually, I found the right rock. I struck it again and again until it broke clean, sharp, mean, hungry like I was. I tied it to a branch with rawhide and sinew, and I had something new in my hands, a tool, a weapon, a beginning. The first time I used it, it felt like lightning, in my arm, the sound of wood cracking under my own force. It made me feel, not big, not powerful, but real, capable. For the first time, the world didn't just happen to me. I happened to it. Lying there now, years later, I reached for that same axe. Weathered, chipped, but still sharp. My hand fit it like it always had, like it belonged there. And I thought, if this tool could bring down a tree, could it raise something that lasts? The idea wasn't new anymore. I had thought it during the storm's aftermath, when the sky was still angry and the earth wet with defeat. But here, in the quiet, beside this fallen trunk, I felt it deepen. This tree had fallen, but it was still here. Maybe I was like this. Tree, cut, broken, but not done. The next morning, I stood with the axe and looked at the forest not as a place to hide in, but as something I could shape. The trees were tall, heavy, older than memory, and I was one man. But my axe remembered. My hands remembered. My pain remembered. And memory is a kind of fire. The others watched me from a distance. They didn't ask questions. Not yet. Maybe they thought I was still grieving. Maybe they thought I had gone mad. But I wasn't mad. I was done waiting. I walked into the forest alone, like I had done before, with nothing but my blade and the ache in my chest. I chose a tree that stood taller than the rest. It reminded me of the first time I dared to cut one down. I whispered to it, not in words, but with silence. Then I swung. The first strike was clumsy. The second was cleaner. By the fifth, I could hear the tree groan. Each hit sent a memory through my bones, of winters survived, of fingers cracked by frost, of fire lit with splinters. My body remembered every time I had needed shelter, and didn't have it. This time, I would not be denied. When the tree finally fell, it didn't scream. it sighed, a slow, heavy release, like something ancient had given in, and I stood there, not proud, not triumphant, but humbled. This was not a victory over nature. This was an agreement. It had given me its body. Now I had to give it purpose. I spent the rest of the day dragging part of the trunk toward the camp. It took hours. My shoulders burned, my back screamed. I slipped, fell, cursed the mud, bled from my palms, but I kept going, because the axe had taught me something. The first step always hurts, but it's the only one that matters. I watched the tree fall, not like a man collapsing, but like a god bowing. It didn't crack or split. It leaned slowly, almost respectfully, then dropped with a deep, earthy thud that shook the ground beneath my feet. Dust rose, birds fled, and silence followed, thick, heavy, sacred. That tree had stood longer than anyone in my tribe. And now it lay at my feet. I stood over it for a while, not moving. I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I expected a rush of pride. But all I felt was weight. The weight of what came next. Chopping down a tree was one thing. Turning it into something no one had ever built before, a house, was something else entirely. I ran my hand over the bark. It was rough, splintered, and cold. Sap oozed where my axe had split its flesh. My fingertips stuck to it, like the tree didn't want to let go. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I didn't either. But I had made a promise. To myself, to the storm, to every broken hut that once stood in the mud. And I would keep it. The first task was to move the trunk. The entire thing was far too massive to carry, so I began cutting it into sections. I thought the hard part was over. It wasn't. Every strike of the axe into its dead wood sent pain back up my arms. Every log I rolled felt like it weighed more than my own body. My muscles screamed, my skin tore, but I didn't stop. Each piece I dragged toward camp was a symbol, not just of effort, but of refusal. Refusal to go back to what was broken. As I pulled the final piece across the dirt, some of the others began to gather at a distance. They said nothing, just watched. One old man shook his head. A woman murmured to her child, as if I were some kind of ghost. They didn't understand what I was doing. I barely understood it myself. All I knew was this. I was tired of shelters that disappeared. I wanted something that stayed. I laid the logs, in a circle, trying to imagine walls. I had seen walls before, cliffs, caves, but never ones that moved with your hands. This was new, terrifying. The logs didn't fit. They rolled, shifted, slipped out of place. They were stubborn, like the forest they came from. I tried sharpening the ends to drive them into the ground. They cracked. I tried laying them flat. They slid. I tried notching them, carving grooves so they could rest on one another. Each method failed, miserably. But every failure taught me something. I learned that not all wood splits the same way. I learned that bark can hide rot. I learned that balance isn't just about weight. It's about trust between two pieces. I also learned that doubt is loudest at night. There were moments, dark, heavy moments, when I sat in the dirt with blood on my palms and thought, maybe the storm was right. Maybe we're meant to crawl in straw forever. But then I'd look at that tree, what was left of it, and I'd remember how it stood for so long, how it didn't run, how it died fighting, and I thought, if wood can do that, so can I. I began again. I tied logs with twisted vines, braced them with stones, carved notches deeper. I adjusted angles, measured by hand, by shadow, by instinct. It wasn't beautiful, but it began to look like something that couldn't be torn down by a gust of wind. something that didn't shiver when thunder growled, something that might one day be called a home. And though no one helped, no one believed, I felt something stir in the air. Not respect. Not yet, but curiosity. Eyes lingered longer. Voices quieted when I walked by, not because I was important, but because I wasn't broken. They started laughing when I tried to lift the frame. It wasn't cruel at first, just confused. One woman pointed, her hand covering her mouth. A man chuckled and said something about me playing with bones. Someone asked if I was building a pen for pigs. Another joked that I had lost my mind in the forest and come back trying to stack trees. Said nothing, because if I had opened my mouth I might have screamed. The weight of the logs was nothing compared to the weight of their words, not because I believed them, but because I almost did. There's a silence that lives between laughter, a space where shame slithers in and tells you, you're foolish, you're alone, and they see it. That silence is colder than any storm, and it burned deeper than the axe ever had. I worked anyway. The vines snapped. The logs fell. My back ached. My knees buckled. And still I worked. Every time I stood one log up, another would tip. Every time I braced a corner, wind shoved it down. My structure looked nothing like a home. It looked like a mistake, lopsided, cracked, and pitiful. But it was my mistake, and I was going to keep making it until it stood. I remember one night. I sat by the fire, alone, watching the stars. My hands were trembling. Blood from my knuckles had dried into the bark. My body begged me to stop, and that's when an elder approached. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, watching the frame swaying in the breeze like a dying animal. Then he said, "The sky will always win." I looked at him. I wanted to argue, wanted to shout that the sky had already won too many times, but I didn't. I just said, "Not this time." He scoffed and walked away, and I let him. Because I wasn't building for him, I wasn't building for them. I was building for the child who cried under wet straw, for the old woman who no longer had dry wood to burn, for the next storm, because I knew it would come. It always came. If I couldn't stop the wind, then I would give us something that didn't fall to it. The next morning, I changed my approach. Instead of stacking logs, I carved grooves, deep joints where wood could rest on wood, not just lean but lock. I dug deeper holes for the posts, filled them with stones. I braced beams with angled supports, using tension instead of force. I stopped fighting the wood and started learning from it. The forest no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a teacher, one that required patience and pain. The laughter didn't stop, but it changed. It grew quieter, less confident. Some laughed, but didn't look me in the eyes. Others watched from farther away. A few even stood silently, curious, cautious, as if wondering what might happen if I succeeded. But that wasn't what drove me. What drove me was the image burned in my skull. The night the storm took everything. The screams, the collapse, the shivering silence. I carried that image like a torch. It lit every failure, every cut, every aching joint. And whenever I thought of giving up, I saw the mud on that woman's face. I heard the hollow thud of falling roofs. I smelled the smoke from fires that couldn't stay lit. That was why I refused to quit. I don't remember how long it took, but one day I stepped back, and the frame was still standing, just a skeleton, but it had shoulders now. Like me, it had bent, but not broken. I ran my fingers along the timber, rough, crooked, real, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of mockery. I felt the weight of beginning. It happened in the middle of the night, There was no storm, no rain, not even wind, just a low, deep crack, like a bone snapping under its own weight. I woke up to the sound, confused. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. Then I saw it, the frame, sagging, one beam shifting, pulling at the others. The joints I carved, once tight, slipping like fingers losing grip. And then, the crash. My first structure fell to the ground like a dying beast. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder, but there was no storm this time, only silence. And me, standing in the middle of it all, barefoot in the dirt, staring at the splinters. The next morning, the village didn't laugh. They didn't need to. Some just looked away. Others pretended they hadn't seen anything. The loudest mockery isn't in the voice. It's in the silence people give you, when they no longer care enough to judge. I didn't speak. What could I say? I'd promised myself I would build something that lasts, and now it lay before me, broken, defeated, proof that maybe I wasn't meant to challenge the old ways. For a long time I just stood there, staring, not at the logs, but at my hands. They were covered in scrapes and dust, proof of work, of intention, of belief. But belief doesn't always build houses. Sometimes it just breaks you open. That day, I didn't touch a single log, didn't pick up my axe, didn't measure, didn't dig, didn't think. I just sat. Because there's a kind of grief that comes from effort. A pain not from loss, but from failing in front of yourself. But the earth kept turning. The sun, still, rose, and that meant the wind would rise again, too. That night, I lay on the ground next to the pile of collapsed timber. I placed my hand on the cracked beam like I was holding a friend who'd lost the fight. I whispered. We tried. And in that whisper, I heard something unexpected. Not an end, but a beginning. The next morning, something changed. I didn't feel stronger, but I felt clearer. The collapse had taught me what no tree ever could. A house is not just wood. It's understanding. I looked over every log, every break, every failed joint. I didn't look at them with anger, but with curiosity. Why did it fall? What held? What didn't? Pain is a brutal teacher, but it's honest. I began again, but not the same way. This time I cut smaller beams, lighter, easier to brace. I widened the base, lowered the frame, changed the angle of the roof. I worked slower, more deliberate. I built supports before I raised walls. I watched shadows, felt where the wind pressed, listened to how the ground responded to weight. The forest wasn't fighting me anymore. It was advising me. People began to notice. Not with words, but with looks. They saw me working again, not as a man chasing madness, but as someone who had lost and returned. And there's something quietly powerful about someone who comes back after being broken. One child, just old enough to walk, wandered close to the new frame one evening. His mother called him back quickly as if I were contagious. But the boy didn't cry. He looked at the new frame and smiled. That was enough. Enough to remind me, I'm not building this for pride. I'm building it so one day someone like him won't have to shiver when the sky turns black. Failure is heavy, but quitting is heavier, and I had no room left for that weight. There's a silence that lives in the wind. It doesn't come during storms. It comes after, when the leaves have fallen, when the fire's burned low, when your body stops aching but your spirit hasn't healed. That's where I lived. After the collapse and after the rebuild began again, something changed. Not in the wood, but in me. I stopped expecting help, stopped hoping for it. The world had shown me what I could count on. My own hands and the silence between storms. I worked from dawn until night. Alone. No footsteps beside mine. No voices in the trees, just the steady rhythm of axe to timber, and the wind. At first, I hated the wind. It reminded me of everything I had lost, the huts, the comfort, the illusion of safety. It carried laughter, doubt, and dust. But slowly, I learned to listen to it. The wind taught me where pressure gathers, where weakness lies in structure, how to brace not just wood, but will. It no longer mocked me. It instructed me. Some nights, I'd sit by the half-built frame and speak aloud, not to anyone, but to the stars, the trees, and, maybe, to the version of myself that nearly gave up. I'd say things like, "You're still breathing. The roof will hold. Let them ignore you." Words that didn't need answers. Words that simply needed to be spoken. Because even alone, you have to remind yourself, you matter. One day, I drove a support beam deep into the ground, deeper than I'd ever gone before. I packed the earth around it with stone, then poured water to harden the soil. When I stepped back, it didn't wobble. It stood, proud. The wind came that night, stronger than usual, but the beam didn't move. Neither did I. That was the first night I slept without flinching. The people still didn't come. But I heard them. At the edges of the trees, they whispered, "He's still building? It hasn't fallen again? Maybe it's luck." They didn't believe yet. Not fully. But doubt had turned to curiosity. And curiosity is the doorway to belief. A boy threw a stone one morning, just a soft toss near the woodpile. Then he ran. I didn't chase him. I didn't yell. I just picked up the stone, set it on the edge of the frame, and kept working. The next day, someone left a vine coil beside my tools. No words, no faces, just something left behind. It was enough. Not help, but recognition. Being alone isn't the same as being forgotten. Sometimes the world watches from the shadows, waiting to see if you'll break. I didn't, because I'd already broken, and come back stronger. I carved joints that locked like jaws, angled rafters that held tension, like muscle. I used wind to test every edge, let it teach me where the flaws lived. I wasn't fighting nature anymore. I was learning its language. One night, I stood inside the unfinished frame. No roof yet, no door, just skeleton beams and hope. The wind blew through, clean and cold, and for the first time, I smiled. Not because I was done, but because I wasn't afraid anymore. There are victories that roar like fire, and there are victories that whisper. Mine whispered. The post stood. That's it. Not a full wall, not a house. Just one, singular, upright beam of wood, driven deep into the earth, braced with stone, tensioned with vine. But it stood all night. And when I woke to the rising sun and saw its shadow cast across the dirt like a blade in the earth, I knew something had changed. I didn't cheer. I didn't dance. I just knelt beside it, ran my hand over its base, and let my forehead touch the grain of the wood. It was solid. It held. For the first time, I had created something that did not fall. Building had taught me many things: pain, failure, loneliness. But this taught me patience. The post didn't stand because I forced it. It stood because I listened. To the ground, to the wind, to the weight of time. I had stopped trying to conquer nature, and instead, I had partnered with it. The village still kept their distance. No one clapped, no one congratulated. But I saw it in their eyes as they passed. Something had shifted. No longer laughter, no longer indifference. It was something closer to wonder. That day, I worked like a man possessed, not frantic, not reckless, but focused, clear. The upright post became my anchor, my measure. Every log I moved, every beam I shaped was in conversation with that one standing truth. It can be done. I carved more joints, smoother, tighter. I studied the curve of each log, letting the wood speak. Some I rejected, some I reshaped. Every part had to want to stand, because it wasn't just about strength. It was about harmony. That's what I hadn't understood before. A house is not a pile of parts. It's a relationship between wood, earth, air, and man. By dusk, I had 3 more posts standing. Not perfect, not finished, but they didn't move. As the sky turned orange, I sat on the edge of my new structure. Not a shelter yet, but no longer a dream. I watched smoke rise from village fires, saw figures moving like ghosts in the evening light. No one came to speak, but no one looked away either, and that was enough. That night, I laid under the stars with my back to the dirt, looking up through the empty space where a roof would one day live. I whispered, "You're no longer building alone." Even the wind builds with you now. Even silence is watching. There was no applause, no celebration, but there was a moment, and sometimes that's all you need to keep going. The sky changed before I felt the wind. It began in the color, gray swallowing blue, clouds folding into themselves like fists. The birds flew low. The trees stopped whispering. Everything held its breath. I knew that silence. I remembered it, and I knew what came next. The storm was coming. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I stood in the center of the frame. 4 upright posts now, rafters lashed, the outline of walls sketched in beams and rope. Not finished, not perfect, but it was real. I looked at it, and I looked at the sky, and I felt fear crawl up my spine, not for myself, but for the work, for what it symbolized, for what would happen if it fell again. I whispered, "Not this time." I secured every joint, tightened every knot, added bracing stones to the base, checked and rechecked the foundation. I didn't eat, I barely drank. My hands were blistered, and my shoulders burned. But I moved like a man chasing fire, because I wasn't going to let the sky win without a fight. By dusk, the wind had come, and it did not knock. It entered, with no apology, no warning. Branches snapped in the trees. Ash flew from campfires. A hut roof in the distance peeled off like dead bark. I dropped to my knees beside the house, pressed my back to the main post, and held on. It was the most violent storm I had ever known. Rain lashed sideways. Wind screamed in my ears. The ground shook like something beneath it was waking up angry. I felt the structure tremble. The ropes strain. The beams creak, and I closed my eyes. Not in prayer. In defiance. I whispered through clenched teeth, "You will not take this from me." Hours passed. I don't know how many. Lightning split the sky again, and I braced every strike with muscle and grit. There was no one else. No help, no shelter, just me, and what I had built. And then it stopped. The storm, like all storms, ran out of rage. The wind fell away. The rain softened. The air held a stillness that felt like apology. And when I opened my eyes, I was still here. More importantly, so was the house. It had held. Every post, every beam, every knot I tied with bleeding fingers. It stood, not untouched, not perfect, but standing, and that was everything. I fell to my knees, not from weakness, but from awe. I touched the soaked earth, looked up at the bruised sky, and laughed. Yes, laughed. Loud, from the belly. Because the storm had thrown everything it had at me, and I was still here. Because for the first time in my life, something I built stood taller than my fear. When I returned to the village the next morning, they stared, not because I was wet, not because I was tired, but because they had heard the crash that never came. They saw the bruises, the cuts, and the look in my eyes that said, "You may not understand me, but you cannot ignore me anymore." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The wind had already spoken for me. They didn't come all at once. They came like shadows at dusk, quiet, cautious, unsure if they were welcome. The storm was gone, but its echo still lived in the village. People spoke in low voices, glancing toward the edge of the trees where my shelter now stood, still upright, scarred, and real. And me? I kept building. I added a crossbeam that morning. My hands still trembled from the storm, but I welcomed the ache. It reminded me that I was still here, still creating. Then I heard it, a small cough, a shuffling footstep. I turned. It was a young boy, the same one who had thrown a rock days ago. He didn't run this time. He just stood there, holding a bundle of vines in his hands. His eyes didn't hold fear. They held something harder to name, respect. I didn't speak. I simply nodded toward the pile of timber. He walked over and set the vines down beside it, then turned and walked away, without a word. That was the first return. Later that day, 2 women passed by and slowed their steps. One of them carried a bundle of herbs. She paused, looked at me, then gently placed the bundle on a nearby rock. "For the pain," she said, and walked on. The next morning, I found a stack of stones arranged near the base of the structure. Flat, strong, just the kind I had been searching for, no name, no note. But I knew. The eyes that once mocked me were now watching for a different reason. Not because they wanted me to fail, but because some small part of them hoped I wouldn't. People didn't ask questions at first. They just came to watch. Men with calloused hands, women with babies on their hips, children holding wooden toys shaped like spears. They stood in silence as I worked. They watched the way I measured weight, the way I balanced pressure, the way I tied vines in X-shaped tension. I could feel their minds absorbing every movement, like seeds pressed into fertile ground. Finally, someone spoke. "How do you keep it from falling?" I looked up. It was the elder, the one who once said, "The sky will always win." His voice didn't sound like mockery this time. It sounded like humility. I answered simply, "You don't fight the wind. You let the wind teach you where to stand." He didn't say more, but he didn't leave either. He stayed. That evening, I lit a fire inside the structure, not a large one, just a flame, cradled in a ring of stone. Smoke rose gently through the open roof frame, and as I sat beside it, a woman approached and asked, "Can others learn?" It wasn't really a question, it was a hope. I said yes, not because I wanted credit, not because I needed followers, but because no one should have to stand alone forever. That night I didn't sleep alone. 2 men stayed by the fire speaking quietly. A boy leaned against a post. An older woman laid down near the entry and closed her eyes like she belonged there. They weren't just watching now. They were returning. I didn't teach by shouting. I taught by doing, one hand guiding another. One mistake corrected with patience. One success shared without pride. The shelter became more than a frame. It became a place where people remembered what it meant to build, not just survive. Some still doubted. Some still kept their distance. That's fine. Even seeds take time to believe they'll become trees. But that week, we placed the first roof beam together. 3 hands, 1 goal. And when it held, when the frame didn't creak or tremble, we all stepped back, breathless, not from effort, but from belief. The house was finished. Not perfect, not polished, but finished. 4 strong walls, a roof of thatch woven into a lattice of wood, a doorway framed with stone, a fire ring at the center circled by smooth, hand-picked rocks. It stood not as a monument, but as a promise. A promise that we didn't have to bow to the wind, that we could learn from the storm, survive it, and then build something better. He lit the fire at dawn. The others gathered slowly, quietly. No songs, no ceremony. Only silence, thick with memory, weight, and something we hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The smoke rose gently, curling into the cold morning air. It danced upward through the roof, into the sky that once tore our homes apart, and, for the first time in many, many seasons, that sky did not feel like an enemy. It felt like witness. Children entered first. They stepped over the threshold with wide eyes, running their fingers along the smooth wood beams, tapping the walls like testing if they were real. They laughed, and that sound was the sound of something ancient being reborn. The women followed, carrying baskets of food and herbs. Some sat by the fire. Others arranged stones into benches. They didn't ask permission. They didn't need to, because the house wasn't mine anymore. It was ours. One by one, the men joined. Many had calluses like mine now, hands that had helped, raise beams, eyes that once doubted, now filled with quiet pride. We didn't speak much, but in every nod, in every hand placed on a post, there was understanding. That afternoon, the elder who once told me, "The sky will always win," walked through the doorway. He didn't say a word. He simply sat by the fire, then looked at me and said, "You built this from the wind." I shook my head. "No," I said, "I built this from refusing to fall with it." That night, for the first time, no one returned to their old huts. They slept here, beneath the beams we shaped with our pain, our stubbornness, our belief. We slept warm. We slept dry. We slept together. And as I lay beneath the roof, listening to the crackle of fire and soft breathing of people around me, I thought, this was never about wood, or shelter, or even survival. This was about choosing not to remain broken. In time, more houses would rise, better ones, stronger, built by hands no longer afraid. But this one, this first one, would always be the beginning. If you ever see smoke rise from a rooftop, if you ever stand inside walls that hold beneath a roof that listens to the wind, know this: someone, somewhere, once refused to live in fear. Someone stood in the storm and chose to build anyway. Someone named Karuk, and I was never the strongest. I was never the smartest, but I was the first to believe we could rise.